You're watching the Air and Space Channel.
The Lockheed Constellation, affectionately known by many as the Connie. One of the most elegant and aesthetically pleasing aircraft to ever take flight. But being a thing of beauty was not its only grace. Lockheed took a giant technological leap to give birth to the Constellation. It was a leap so far ahead as to give Connie a lease on life, extending long after many of her prop-powered rivals rusted into obsolescence in the era of the turbojet. Her perfection of form and function can be traced to the dawn of commercial aviation. She was the end product of years of battles between the airlines for dominance of the skies. This struggle for economic survival would see the airlines and airliner evolve into their ultimate modern forms and unite the globe through air travel. In the late 20s, the fledgling American airline industry was still using aircraft like this Ford trimotor with its fixed landing gear. Technically primitive aircraft, by today's standards, and capable of short hops between cities only. Intercontinental airlines still relied on railways to ferry passengers for part of their trips. In this early age of aviation, the rules governing airlines and safety were still being written, sometimes lagging behind quickly evolving aerospace technology. Although not as dangerous as a ride with a daredevil barnstormer, a commercial flight could still be a risky proposition. A fatal crash in 1931 opened the world's eyes to the perils of flight.
That year, TWA Flight 599 came down in the Kansas prairie, killing famous football personality Knute Rockne and 7 others.
Rockne was a passenger on another type of trimotor, the Fokker F7. Unlike the all-metal Ford trimotor, it had wooden wing components, and moisture may have weakened the glue holding them together, causing them to fail during flight. Rockne was beloved by the American public, and the Rockne crash, as it became known, led to major changes in commercial aviation standards. Some improvement in speed, safety, and comfort were seen early in 1933, when the Curtiss Company launched the Condor airliner. Though it was a biplane and had a traditional frame and fabric construction, it had a tubular metal wing spar. The Rockne crash caused wooden aircraft to become the pariah of the airlines. As commercial flights became longer, passenger comfort became a greater priority. The Condor was the first aircraft to offer sleeping berths for overnight flights. Like today's airliners, it also had its own galley, providing fresh hot food and beverages for its passengers. Only about 40 Condors left the production line, and it did advance the passenger airliner, but an innovative new aircraft from Boeing would set the next benchmark for civil aviation. Boeing's Model 247 was breathtaking in comparison to anything else available, and all the airlines wanted it. It was faster than the fastest American fighter of the day, and it could beat the Condor across the USA by 8 hours. It was also a safer, more comfortable plane for its 10 passengers. It was all metal in construction and could fly on a single engine if one should fail. As well, the cabin was soundproofed and air-conditioned. The 247 was a solid design that could have dominated, but corporate greed got in the way. Boeing sold 60 of its aircraft to its affiliate airline, Boeing Air Transport, part of UATC, the predecessor to United Airlines. TWA and others were clamoring to get their own 247s, but their orders were to be postponed until the entire United order was fulfilled. Locked out, TWA and other airlines turned to aircraft manufacturers Douglas and Lockheed to build their new fleets. From Lockheed, the company that would one day create the Constellation, came the Model 10 Electra. Like the 247, it could initially carry 10 passengers, was of all-metal construction, and had twin engines. By this time, single-engine aircraft had been banned for all passenger and night flights. Kelly Johnson, then a student assistant at the University of Michigan, did much of the wind tunnel work on the Electra. He was a champion of the Electra's twin tails, which would later become a hallmark of Lockheed aircraft. Johnson would become a leading light at Lockheed and contribute to the Constellation's design. The Electra was a decent alternative to the 247, but Douglas had an aircraft in the works that would eclipse both of them and come to dominate civil air travel. TWA had turned to Douglas when their 247 orders had been rejected. The airline was looking for a new tri-motor, but Douglas answered with a groundbreaking line of aircraft. The DCs, short for Douglas Commercials. These twin-engine, all-metal aircraft had the range and seating capacity to knock all competitors out of the sky. From the prototype DC-1 to the DC-2 to the DC-3, seating went up from 12 to 14 to 21. In terms of performance, the DC-3 could fly eastward across the USA in 15 hours, with just 3 refueling stops. Hundreds of DC-3s were constructed, compared to just 75 Boeing 247s. With so many of their planes in the air, Douglas had a major role in popularizing air travel. But for all the improvements that had taken place, aircraft manufacturers still had a long way to go in terms of performance and comfort achieved by a pressurized aircraft like the Constellation. Pressurizing an airliner would allow passengers and pilots to fly comfortably at higher altitudes and in the jet stream, cutting flight time and fuel costs. But it wasn't until 1937 that the first U.S. experiments got underway. It was in that year that the U.S. Army commissioned Lockheed to modify a standard Model 10 Electra with a new pressurized fuselage. The XC-35 was a watershed in aircraft design. It was an experimental aircraft constructed to prove that it was feasible to fly above the storms. Windows were smaller than found on the Electra for fears of a blowout. All these modifications allowed the XC-35 to fly at 30,000 feet and take advantage of the jet stream. The age of pressurized aircraft had arrived. With this new technology in hand, airlines were looking ahead to a time when they could offer non-stop coast-to-coast flights and intercontinental flights, carrying enough passengers to make such trips economically feasible. To do so, they would need an all-metal, 4-engine plane, large enough to carry 40-plus passengers over a distance of 2,000 miles. In 1935, before the first DC-3 had risen into the air, United Airlines had expressed serious interest in an aircraft with these specifications and went to Douglas for help. 5 other airlines joined United's venture, including TWA, each contributing $100,000 apiece to the project. It was a small amount of money compared to the millions their investment might return. Douglas answered their challenging specifications with the DC-4E. It was a 4-engine aircraft that could carry 42 passengers, twice as many as the DC-3, a distance of over 2,000 miles. Like the later Constellation, it had a tricycle landing gear and a triple tail. It also had air conditioning, power-boosted controls, and production versions were to be pressurized. Such an aircraft could change the landscape of civil aviation, but as development costs increased, Pan Am and TWA lost interest. The prototype DC-4E did fly in June of 1938, and testing was successful, but it was too expensive, and performance was below expectations. The project was canceled. In the end, the prototype was sold to Japanese Imperial Airways, who secretly reverse-engineered the aircraft to create the Nakajima G5N bomber. Japan wasn't the only nation gearing up for war. In the late 1930s, with communism and fascism at odds with each other and global tensions rising, war was a possibility, and aircraft manufacturers were preparing for the battles ahead while still keeping an eye on the civil market. Boeing attempted to re-engineer their B-17 bomber to create a new airliner, the 307. Boeing fused B-17 wings, undercarriage, and tail section onto a new, wider pressurized cabin to create the 307. It could fly its passengers in comfort high above any bad weather. However, because of its B-17 heritage, the 307 still had to utilize a tailwheel, making for less safe takeoffs and landings than an aircraft with tricycle landing gear like the DC-4E. Altogether, only 10 307s were sold. At this time, Lockheed was in development of their own four-engine passenger plane, the Model 044 Excalibur, which at first glance appeared to be a larger version of the Model 10 Electra. Howard Hughes would call for radical changes to this design that would reshape the Electra into the ultimate prop airliner. When Hughes gained control of TWA in 1939, he wanted an airliner which incorporated all the latest technology available. But no such aircraft were in the air. On top of his technical requirements, he was looking for great style and extra performance. Funding from the lucrative Hughes Tool Company was the only way Howard Hughes could pay for such an ambitious project. With cash in hand, there was little doubt that he would get his way. The final rendition of Lockheed's super airliner model was so different from the 044 Excalibur first proposed that it was also given a new name, the L049 Constellation. The plans for this streamlined, elegant aircraft fit Hughes's bill for style and performance. Lockheed designers, including Kelly Johnson, borrowed elements from other aircraft to create the Constellation. It was pressurized like the XC-35 and able to fly its crew and passengers at a ceiling of 24,000 feet. As well, its wings were adapted from those of Lockheed's P-38 Lightning, and its triple tail and tricycle landing gear were reminiscent of those of the Douglas DC-4E. Even with such a stellar design in the works, the more primitive Excalibur was not cancelled. It has been suggested that the more modest Excalibur concept had actually been kept in development to distract interest away from the greatly advanced Constellation. This was part of a ploy to keep TWA's monopoly of the Connie. Since Boeing had executed a similar maneuver to keep their 247 out of TWA's hands, there is little doubt that Howard Hughes was capable of such tactics. Just as the contracts were signed and planning for the Constellation prototype got underway, the world braced itself for war. Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Force, voiced serious concerns over the rise of Nazi Germany. He stressed the need for a backup for the already planned B-29, a long-range bomber capable of striking the U.S.'s foes wherever they might be. Lockheed was now obliged to develop a bomber version of the Constellation, the XB-30, to play understudy to the B-29. The plan for the Connie's conversion was simple and lauded by the Air Force. Graft a Constellation's wings and tail section onto a new fuselage, housing bombs rather than passengers. In the end, however, there was no need for a backup bomber. Boeing delivered the B-29 Superfortress, and the XB-30 was cancelled. The end of the XB-30 was not the end of the Constellation's military career. In December 1941, when the war came to America, the military took control of the entire L049 project. The Constellation became the C-69, a high-speed transport aircraft for troop movement. In January of 1943, 4 years after Hughes proposed its groundbreaking design, the C-69 finally took to the skies. It was still several months before all engine problems were sorted out, and the aircraft was handed over to the Army Air Force. The second C-69 had a much more glamorous debut. Though it was still a military machine, it was allowed to be presented in striking TWA livery. Even more surprising was that Howard Hughes was allowed to pilot it trans-America on a record-breaking flight. a record at the time equal to any belonging to a modern fighter. A great deal of successful publicity was gained for all concerned, and the Connie was certainly winning hearts, but not that many orders. In fact, the total number of wartime deliveries was just 22.
The Army was in desperate need of transport aircraft. They just weren't buying them from Lockheed.
After the failure of the two advanced Douglas DC-4E, Douglas went straight back to the drawing board and produced a far less ambitious aircraft, originally known as the DC-4, with no E. It was quickly militarized into the C-54 Skymaster. C-54s had no pressurized cabin, and although they did incorporate a tricycle landing gear like the earlier DC-4E, overall they had a much simpler layout. This made for quicker production, easier service, and greater reliability, exactly what America needed in a wartime situation. With all of these advantages, the C-54s drained away the Constellation's military orders. Between 1942 and into the early post-war years, over 1,200 C-54s and DC-4s were produced. But the aviation marketplace was quickly changing. As World War II ended, aircraft manufacturers had to reverse course and focus their energies on the civilian market. A number of Skymasters found their way into post-war civil use, with some being retrofitted with pressurized cabins. It was in this early post-war period that the Constellation sales took off. Her extra size, more powerful engines, and pressurized cabin all became prerequisite features for a new generation of airliners. Luxury and comfort were now being offered, and the public was willing to pay for Constellation quality. However, Lockheed's competitors weren't ready to concede defeat. Boeing was looking to capitalize on the success and technology of the B-29. They started by creating a new tanker, the C-97. Like the proposed Lockheed XB-30, they took the wings and tail section of an existing aircraft, the B-29, and grafted them onto a new, larger double-decker fuselage. The C-97s were originally built in large numbers as Air Force tankers and freighters. However, it didn't take Boeing too long to see the lucrative potential of the airliner market. The Boeing Model 377, or Stratocruiser, was an airliner version of the C-97. With its second deck providing much greater seating capacity and its extra range, the 377 looked like it would give the early Constellations some serious competition in the luxury airliner market. However, only 56 aircraft were produced. They certainly delivered all that was promised in the luxury department, but they proved uneconomical to run. Also, 2 serious accidents resulting from their complicated engine and propeller arrangement became a source of serious concern. Although the Stratocruiser had only a limited impact on the civilian airliner market, Lockheed and the Connie still had one more player to contend with. When the war was still raging, the Army had contracted with Douglas to make an advanced Skymaster prototype, longer and with more powerful engines, and at last with a pressurized fuselage. At war's end, Douglas would take the prototype and research paid for by the Army and use them to create their new civilian offering, the DC-6. Its overall look was somewhat more sedate than the elegant Connie, but it would still prove a very worthy adversary. Throughout the decade that followed, many modified DC-4s and hundreds of brand new DC-6s and later DC-7s fought it out with numerous generations of ever-improving Constellations. As Lockheed and Douglas tried to capture the imagination and contracts of airlines around the world, they increased the seating capacity, range, and storage of the respective aircraft. With airliners available to take passengers around the globe, the long-range airline business grew in all directions. Luxury travel was augmented by tourist and economy seating. The term coach became common at travel agents and airport check-ins. Lower fares meant higher volume and access to an entirely new market of average middle-class citizens. This boom in international travel was not dampened by the Cold War being waged between the world's superpowers. In this tense time, America's two main airliner manufacturers benefited from military orders. Douglas continued to provide transports as it had in World War II, while Lockheed created a new early warning radar aircraft, the Warning Star. Over 230 of these advanced electronic surveillance aircraft provided critical support for the Air Force and Navy, especially during the Vietnam conflict. Business was booming for Lockheed and Douglas in both the military and civilian markets, but soon their streak of good fortune would come to an abrupt end. Rival Boeing returned with an unbeatable new aircraft design, which would rattle the foundations of the airliner world, the jet-powered 707. Boeing's president, Bill Allen, had bet the company on this aircraft. The 707's swept wings, potted jet engines, and other advanced technology made the Constellation and DC-6s and 7s seem like antiques from a bygone era. In a brilliant business move, Allen created a militarized version of the 707, the KC-135 tanker, in parallel with the 707, allowing him to save money on research and development and tap into the military and civilian markets simultaneously. In 1957, the same year the 707 took flight, Lockheed unveiled its most advanced constellation, the Starliner. It was packed with new advanced features. The Starliner's turbo compound engines allowed it to fly non-stop from California to Europe. But the aircraft was costly compared to similar offerings from Douglas. As well, airlines wanted to add jets to their inventories, not only for performance, but for prestige. There was more bad news for Lockheed on the military front. Although the Warning Star would continue to play an important role as an early warning aircraft into the Vietnam War, it was ultimately superseded by the Boeing E-3 Sentry, a radar-equipped version of the 707. Douglas and Lockheed both attempted to wrench the jetliner monopoly from Boeing, but only Douglas was able to crack the market successfully with their DC-8. DC-8s and 707s battled for air supremacy, just as the DC-6s and 7s had competed with the Constellations in the years leading up to the jetliners. In the mid-70s, Lockheed did attempt a comeback in the airliner market with their jet-powered TriStar. 250 aircraft were sold, but it was far below sales targets. Lockheed exited the civilian market once and for all and instead concentrated on military aircraft. Constellations, once the most advanced airliners in the world, were gradually phased out. They were relegated to backup roles, shorter routes, and ultimately served as freighters. Connie, the Queen of the Skies, was a victim of old age and progress and had to abdicate her throne to the jetliner. She aged gracefully, serving smaller airlines up until the 1990s. Civil aviation went through several revolutions since the early trimotors hopped across the U.S. In this time, airlines rose and fell, and aircraft manufacturers pushed technology forward as they battled for their share of the civilian market. Today's network of airlines and aircraft unifying the globe are the end result.
You're watching the Air and Space Channel.